My name is Sarah, and I have been a nurse for 15 years. I work in the ICU at St. Mary's Hospital, and the night shift has always been the most challenging, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that week. It all started on a Monday. The shift was calm until one of the patients, Mrs. Thompson, began to have cardiac arrest. I rushed to her bedside and started CPR. As I compressed her chest, I noticed something strange. Her eyes were open, fixed on me. It wasn't uncommon for patients to open their eyes during CPR, but there was something different about her gaze. It was as if she was conscious. We managed to stabilize her, but those eyes haunted me for the rest of the night. On Tuesday, Mrs. Thompson was in an induced coma. I checked her vital signs, and as I approached her bed, I heard a whisper, "Sarah, help me." I froze. She was sedated. It was impossible for her to be speaking. I looked around, but I was alone in the room. I decided to ignore it, blaming fatigue. On Wednesday, things got worse. A new patient arrived, Mr. Johnson, a severe car accident victim. He was restless, muttering incoherently. When I went to administer his medication, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "They are coming," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "Who is coming?" I asked, trying to calm him. "Those who dwell in the shadows," he replied, before falling unconscious. That night, the ICU lights started to flicker. The emergency generator should have kicked in, but nothing happened. In the darkness, I heard moans from several beds. They weren't moans of pain. They were different, inhuman. I turned on my phone's flashlight and saw something that made me freeze. All the patients were sitting up in their beds, staring at me. On Thursday, I asked to switch shifts. I couldn't take the night shift anymore. My supervisor, Dr. Miller, denied my request. "Sarah, you're our best night nurse. We can't lose you," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I returned to the shift that night, determined to stay calm. Everything seemed normal until I entered Mrs. Thompson's room. She was awake, sitting up in bed. "Sarah, dear, you finally came to take me," she said, smiling. Her smile was too wide, showing sharp teeth that certainly weren't there before. I ran out of the room only to find the corridor engulfed in darkness. The life support machines beeped erratically. At the end of the corridor, I saw a figure. It was Mr. Johnson, but something was wrong with him. His body was contorted at an impossible angle, and he moved like a spider towards me. I tried to scream for help, but my voice was gone. I ran to the nurse's station and locked the door. I picked up the phone to call security, but only heard heavy breathing on the other end. The door began to shake as if something was trying to get in. Friday came, and I hadn't slept. I spent the entire night locked in that room, hearing screams and scratching sounds outside. When the sun rose, everything went silent. I cautiously stepped out and found the ICU in perfect order. The patients were sleeping peacefully, the machines functioning normally. Dr. Miller appeared, smiling as always. "Are you all right, Sarah? You look tired." I tried to explain what had happened, but he just laughed. "I think you need a vacation. Why don't you take a few days off?" I accepted the offer immediately. I spent the weekend at home trying to convince myself that it had all been stress-induced hallucinations. On Monday, I returned to work, determined to face my fears. The shift started normally. I made my rounds, checking on the patients. Everything was calm. Late at night, I was called to the room of a new patient, Mr. Davis. He had arrived unconscious and unidentified. As I entered the room, I noticed Mr. Davis was awake. "Nurse," he called in a hoarse voice. I approached his bed. "Yes, Mr. Davis. Do you need something?" He smiled, a smile that reminded me of Mrs. Thompson. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "For what?" I asked, confused. "For bringing us back," he replied. His face began to change, the skin darkening and stretching over his bones. Horrified, I saw it was no longer Mr. Davis in the bed. It was Dr. Miller, his face a demonic mask. "Welcome back, Sarah," he said, his voice now a chorus of thousands. "We missed you." The lights flickered, and for a moment I saw the room as it really was, full of shadowy creatures, all staring at me with hungry eyes. When the lights came back, I was alone with Mr. Davis, who slept peacefully. I left the room trembling, unsure of what was real. I then realized a terrible truth. I had never left the hospital that weekend. I never went home. I was trapped there, in an endless cycle of terror. Now, I write this as a warning. If you come to St. Mary's Hospital and see me working the night shift, run. Because it won't be me. Not anymore. And if you're admitted here, pray that I'm not your nurse. Because when night falls and the lights flicker, it will be too late to escape. My name is Jessica, and I have been a nurse in the ICU at Mercy Hospital for 12 years. I thought I had seen it all in that time, but what happened that October night completely changed my perception of reality. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I arrived for the night shift at 7 p.m. as usual. The shift handover was smooth, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. I began my usual rounds, checking the patients one by one. It was when I reached bed 13 that everything changed. There was a man there. He looked about 60 years old with gray hair and pale skin. But something was wrong. I didn't remember seeing him during the handover. I grabbed the clipboard at the foot of the bed, expecting to find his history. It was blank. Confused, I called my colleague, Nancy. "Hey, do you know anything about the patient in bed 13? I asked. Nancy frowned. "Bed 13? But it was empty the last time I checked." We went back to the room together. The man was still there, motionless, his eyes closed. Nancy turned pale. "Jesse, I swear this bed was empty 10 minutes ago." We decided to check the system. No admission record for bed 13, no transfer, nothing. It was as if the man had simply materialized in the bed. We called Dr. Thompson, the attending physician. He was as perplexed as we were. "We need to identify this patient," he said, frowning. "Jessica, keep an eye on him while we try to sort this out." The following hours were a blur of phone calls and frantic searches through records. No one knew who the man was or how he had gotten there. Meanwhile, I watched him. His vital signs were stable, but he didn't wake up. There was something strange about his presence. The air around him seemed colder, denser. Around 3 a.m., I noticed movement. His eyes opened suddenly, fixing on me. They were such a pale blue they were almost white. "Finally," he whispered, his voice hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in years. "You can see me." I swallowed hard. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Names are for the living, nurse, and well, I'm beyond that now." A shiver ran down my spine. Before I could respond, the lights flickered. When they came back on, the man was gone. The bed was empty, the covers perfectly arranged, as if no one had been there. I ran to get the others, but when we returned, there was no sign of him. The security cameras showed nothing. One moment he was there, the next, he had simply vanished. In the days that followed, we tried to rationalize the incident. Maybe it was an administrative error, they said. Maybe the man was a confused patient who had gotten lost. But I knew the truth. There was something more going on. A week later, I was back on the night shift. I avoided looking at bed 13, which remained empty. Around midnight, I heard a sound coming from that direction. It was a faint beep, like a heart monitor. Reluctantly, I went to check. The bed was still empty, but the monitor beside it showed vital signs. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. All from a patient who wasn't there. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was, the mysterious man. But something was different. His skin was paler, almost translucent. His eyes, once light blue, were now completely black. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice echoing impossibly in the small room. "I was never a patient. I am what comes after, what waits for all of you." The lights started flickering frantically. I saw shadows moving on the walls, impossible shapes defying logic. The man took a step toward me, his body seeming to distort reality around him. "This hospital," he continued, "is a place between worlds, a portal. And you, Jessica, you have the gift. You can see beyond the veil." I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was gone. The man was getting closer. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "Soon you'll understand. Soon you'll join us." At that moment, I heard voices in the hallway. Nancy and Dr. Thompson rushed into the room. "Jessica, what's going on?" Nancy shouted. I blinked, confused. The man had disappeared again, but something was wrong. Nancy and Dr. Thompson were looking at me with a mix of shock and horror. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dr. Thompson took a hesitant step forward. "Jessica, you're floating." I looked down and my heart nearly stopped. My feet were inches off the ground. Worse, I could see through them. My entire body was becoming translucent. I screamed, but the sound that came out wasn't my voice. It was a distorted echo, as if from far away. I saw the panic in my colleagues' eyes as they tried to reach me, but their hands passed right through me. "No," I cried. "Please help me." But it was too late. I felt as if I were being pulled backward, away from the reality I knew. The last thing I saw was the face of the mysterious man, smiling from the shadows. Now I'm here, trapped between worlds. I can see the hospital, the patients, my colleagues, but they can't see me. Not anymore. I'm stuck in bed 13, a ghost among the living. And the worst part, I'm not alone. There are others here, lost souls like me. And every night when the lights go out and silence takes over the ICU, we wait. We wait for someone like me, someone who can see beyond the veil, someone we can bring to our side. So if you ever find yourself at Mercy Hospital and pass by bed 13, don't look too closely. Don't pay attention to the whispers or the shadows in the corner of your eye. Because if you see us, we'll see you too. And once you cross that threshold, there's no going back. I am Jessica, and this is my story. A story that will never end, for I am trapped in this eternal cycle. And if you're reading this, be careful, because now you know. And knowing is the first step toward joining us. My name is Melissa, and I have been working as a nurse in the ICU at St. Joseph Hospital for 8 years. I've never been superstitious, but the events of the past few weeks have made me question everything I believed in. It all started on a Wednesday night. I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something strange in bed 7. The heart monitor was showing erratic readings, but the patient, Mr. Roberts, seemed to be sleeping peacefully. I approached to check the electrodes and felt an intense cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I adjusted the electrodes, but the readings remained unstable. I decided to call Dr. Peterson for an evaluation. While waiting, I heard a whisper, "Help me." I looked at Mr. Roberts, but his lips didn't move. The whisper came again, more urgent. "Please, help me." Dr. Peterson arrived and examined Mr. Roberts. He found nothing unusual. The readings returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. In the following days, strange things continued to happen at bed 7. Objects moved, monitors failed constantly, and the air was always cold, even with the air conditioning off. Other staff members noticed too, but no one could explain it. One night, while organizing some files, I found an old report about an incident at bed 7. 10 years ago, a patient named Edward Thompson mysteriously died in that bed. The case was filed as a natural death, but there were inconsistencies in the report. Driven by curiosity and a strange sense of duty, I decided to investigate. I spent hours sifting through old files and discreetly talking to older staff members. Edward Thompson's story was nebulous, full of gaps and contradictions. A retired nurse, Mrs. Clark, finally gave me some answers. "The Thompson case was covered up," she whispered, looking around nervously. "There was negligence. Someone made a grave mistake, but the hospital covered it up." The more I discovered, the more disturbed I became. Edward Thompson was a healthy 45-year-old man who came in for a routine surgery. Something went wrong during the procedure, but the details were vague. He was transferred to the ICU, to bed 7, where he died hours later. The next night, I stayed after my shift. Bed 7 was empty, and I was determined to find out the truth. I sat on the bed, the familiar cold enveloping me immediately. "Edward Thompson," I called softly, "if you're here, please show yourself." The silence was broken by a low hum. The lights flickered, and suddenly I saw a figure in the corner of the room. It was a man, translucent, with an expression of deep sadness. "You called me," he said, his voice a distant echo. I swallowed hard, fighting against the fear. "Yes. I want to know what happened to you." Edward's specter approached. "They killed me," he whispered. "It was a mistake, but they covered it up." Edward told me about his surgery. The anesthetist, Dr. James, was distracted and administered the wrong dose. Edward woke up in the middle of the procedure in agony. Panic caused his heart to fail. Instead of admitting the mistake, the team tried to cover it up. "They brought me here to this bed and let me die," Edward said, his form flickering with emotion. "I've been trapped here since, unable to move on, needing the truth to be revealed." I promised Edward I would expose the truth. In the following days, I gathered all the evidence I could. I confronted Dr. James, now head of the anesthesia department, with what I had discovered. He broke down, confessing everything. The hospital was forced to acknowledge the error and compensate Edward's family. I thought that would be the end of it, that Edward could finally rest in peace. I was wrong. The night after the hospital's public confession, I returned to bed 7. Edward's spirit was there, clearer than ever. "Thank you," he said, "but it's not over yet." "What do you mean?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Edward's face twisted into a mask of rage. "They need to feel what I felt, the agony, the fear, the betrayal." Before I could react, Edward lunged at me. I felt an intense cold envelop me, as if being plunged into ice. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. "You will be my instrument of revenge," Edward's voice echoed in my mind. I struggled to regain control, but it was useless. I felt my body move against my will, leaving the room and walking through the hospital corridors. My mind screamed in protest, but I was trapped, a spectator in my own body. I saw my hands, no, Edward's hands using my body, pick up a scalpel. Horror overcame me when I realized where we were going, the operating room where Dr. James was performing surgery. "No," I screamed mentally. "Edward, please, this won't fix anything." But he didn't listen. We entered the operating room. Dr. James looked up, confused by my presence. Before anyone could react, my body moved with supernatural speed. Chaos ensued, alarms blared, people screamed, blood stained the sterile white floor. When I finally regained control, I was surrounded by security and horrified colleagues. Dr. James lay on the ground, gravely injured. I looked at my blood-stained hands, unable to believe what had happened. I was taken away by the police, screaming about spirits and possession. No one believed me, of course. How could they? Now, sitting in this cold cell, I await my trial. I know no one will believe my story. Sometimes I don't even believe it myself. But on silent nights, when shadows lengthen, I hear Edward's voice. He laughs, satisfied with his revenge. And he promises this is just the beginning. Every time I close my eyes, I see bed 7. And I wonder, how many more will Edward drag into his eternal vengeance? How many more will suffer before he finally finds peace? The worst part is knowing that somehow it all started with me, with my curiosity, my desire to help. Now I'm trapped in this endless nightmare, haunted not only by Edward but by the guilt of what I did, what he made me do. And every day I fear he will return, that he will use my body again for his relentless revenge. Because now I know the terrible truth. Some secrets should remain buried. Some souls are too tormented to find peace. If you ever find yourself at St. Joseph Hospital, stay away from bed 7. And if you hear a whisper asking for help, run. Run before it's too late. Before you, like me, become part of this never-ending horror story. My name is Daniel, and I have been a nurse for only 6 months. Freshly graduated, I got a job at Greenwood Hospital, a century-old institution on the outskirts of the city. The old building with its stone walls and narrow corridors intimidated me a bit, but I was excited to start my career. My first month went by without incident. I worked the night shift in the intensive care unit, mainly caring for critically ill or comatose patients. That's when I met Jimmy Watson, a 12-year-old boy who had been in a deep coma for 3 months after a severe car accident. One particularly quiet night, I was doing my rounds when I heard voices coming from Jimmy's room. I found it strange since it wasn't visiting hours. As I approached the slightly open door, I saw a woman sitting by Jimmy's bed, holding his hand and speaking softly. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said, entering the room. "Visiting hours are over. I'm going to have to ask you to..." My voice faltered when the woman turned around. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes had an ethereal glow. But what shocked me the most was that I could see the wall through her. Before I could react, she smiled sadly and disappeared into thin air. I was paralyzed, trying to process what I had just seen. I convinced myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. The next morning, during the shift handover, the day nurse, Sarah, mentioned something surprising. Jimmy's vital signs had slightly improved during the night. In the following days, I began to notice a pattern. Every night, around 2 a.m., the mysterious woman appeared in Jimmy's room, and every morning, there was a slight improvement in his condition. I decided to investigate. Searching through the hospital records, I discovered that Jimmy's mother, Elizabeth Watson, had died in the accident that left the boy in a coma. The photo in the file chilled me. It was the woman I saw every night. I confronted Sarah with my findings, but she just laughed. "Daniel, you're overworked. Ghosts don't exist." But I knew what I had seen, and Jimmy's improvements were undeniable. After 2 weeks of nightly visits, he began to respond to simple stimuli. After a month, he opened his eyes for the first time. The medical staff was perplexed. They called it a miracle, unable to explain the sudden recovery. Only I knew the truth, but who would believe me? One night, I decided to confront Elizabeth's spirit. I waited in Jimmy's room until she appeared. "I know who you are," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Why are you here?" Elizabeth looked at me with sad eyes. "I couldn't protect him that day. Now I'm doing what I should have done." "But how?" I asked. "How are you healing him?" She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her dull eyes. "There is a price for everything, Daniel. I am giving Jimmy what he needs. My life force." A shiver ran down my spine. What does that mean? It means that when Jimmy fully awakens, I will disappear. Forever. In the following days, I saw Elizabeth becoming weaker and more transparent while Jimmy grew stronger. It was as if she was transferring her own existence to her son. Finally, on a rainy night, Jimmy opened his eyes completely. He looked around, confused, and then focused on an empty spot beside his bed. A weak smile formed on his lips. "Mom?" he whispered. I turned and saw Elizabeth, now almost invisible, smiling at her son. She reached out, touching Jimmy's face one last time before disappearing completely. Jimmy recovered quickly after that, to the astonishment of all the doctors. He didn't remember the accident or the time he had spent in a coma. To him, it was as if he had slept for a night and woken up healed. I thought that would be the end of the story. How naive I was. 2 weeks after Jimmy was discharged, I started noticing strange things happening in the hospital. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered for no apparent reason, and an inexplicable cold lingered in the corridors. One night, while checking on an elderly patient, I heard a whisper behind me, "My son. Where is my son?" I turned and saw Elizabeth, but she was different. Her eyes, once sad, now burned with a supernatural fury. Her body, once ethereal, seemed more solid, more present. "Elizabeth?" I called, my voice failing. "What's happening?" She approached, her face contorted in a mask of anger and pain. "I gave everything for him, my life, my existence, and now I'm stuck here, unable to see him, to touch him." The air around us grew cold, and I could see my breath forming clouds of vapor. The heart monitors began beeping frantically. "I need a body," Elizabeth hissed, her eyes fixed on me. "I need to feel again, to touch my son again." Before I could react, I felt an intense cold envelop me. It was like thousands of icy needles piercing my skin. I tried to scream, but my voice vanished. I felt my consciousness being pushed to the back of my mind while another presence took control. Horrified, I watched my own hands move against my will. "Thank you, Daniel," I heard my own voice say, but the tone was Elizabeth's. "You helped me save my son. Now you'll help me stay with him forever." I fought, trying to regain control, but it was useless. I felt my body moving toward the hospital exit. The last things I saw before my consciousness was completely suppressed were my own eyes in the reflection of a window. Eyes now glowing with the same ethereal light I had seen in Elizabeth's. My body left the hospital, walking purposefully toward the house where Jimmy now lived with his father. Elizabeth, using my body, was determined to reclaim the son she had saved. And I, trapped within my own mind, could only watch helplessly as she used my body for her supernatural purposes. Jimmy's miracle had turned into an endless nightmare, not just for me, but for anyone who crossed Elizabeth's path in her relentless quest to reunite with her son. My name is Rachel Thompson, and I have been a nurse at Mercy General Hospital for 15 years. I thought I had seen everything in that time, but the events of the past few months have shaken my sanity and my faith in humanity. It all began when I noticed a strange pattern among our terminal patients. Normally, death is a difficult, often painful process, but recently terminal patients seem to pass away in a serene manner, almost too peacefully. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Perhaps we were improving in palliative care. But then I noticed something else. All these peaceful deaths occurred during the night shift, when Nurse Kevin Walsh was on duty. Kevin was new to the hospital, having joined the staff about 6 months ago. He was quiet, efficient, and the patients seemed to like him. But there was something in his eyes, an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I decided to investigate further. I began staying after my shift, hiding in the nurse's break room, watching Kevin through the security cameras. For weeks, I saw nothing unusual. Kevin did his rounds, cared for the patients, everything perfectly normal. I was about to give up when, on a rainy Thursday night, I saw something that chilled my blood. Kevin entered the room of Mrs. Johnson, a terminal cancer patient. He closed the door behind him, something we rarely did to facilitate monitoring. I tensed, my eyes glued to the screen. Minutes passed. Nothing. I was about to check personally when Kevin left the room, but there was something different about him. His posture was rigid, his movements mechanical, and his eyes, even through the low-resolution camera, I could see they were completely black. I ran to Mrs. Johnson's room, my heart pounding in my chest. When I entered, she was dead, but not as we normally saw. Her face was serene, almost smiling, and the room smelled of incense and something metallic I couldn't identify. In the days that followed, I watched Kevin more closely. I began to notice small details, the strange symbols he discreetly drew on the doors of the rooms, the whispers in a language I didn't recognize, the small objects he carried hidden in his pockets. Finally, on a particularly busy night, I saw my chance. Kevin was called to an emergency on another floor. Quickly, I entered the small room we used to store our personal belongings. I found Kevin's locker and, with trembling hands, opened it. What I found inside made me recoil in horror. There were black candles, dried herbs I didn't recognize, and an old book bound in, something that looked terribly like human skin. I picked up the book, my stomach turning. The pages were filled with strange symbols and disturbing diagrams. Even without understanding the words, I could feel the evil emanating from those pages. "You shouldn't have seen that, Rachel." Kevin's voice made me jump. I turned, the book falling from my trembling hands. Kevin stood at the door, his face a mask of calm that didn't reach his cold eyes. "What? What is this, Kevin?" I stammered. "What have you been doing?" Kevin sighed, closing the door behind him. "I'm helping them, Rachel, easing their passage." "Passage? You're killing them." "No," Kevin said, his voice soft, almost hypnotic. "I'm guiding them. This world is cruel, Rachel, full of pain and suffering. I show them a better path." As Kevin spoke, I felt a strange sensation spreading through my body. It was as if the air around us had become denser, heavier. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, gaining a life of their own. "You don't understand now," Kevin continued, taking a step towards me. "But I can show you. I can open your eyes to the truth beyond the veil." I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I were paralyzed, trapped by Kevin's intense gaze. "Don't fight it, Rachel," he whispered. "Embrace the truth. See what I see." Suddenly, the world around me seemed to distort. The hospital walls disappeared, replaced by an infinite void. And in that void, I saw things. Creatures beyond human comprehension, writhing and moving in impossible patterns. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Kevin was beside me, his form now distorted, more shadow than man. "These are the guardians of the beyond," his voice echoed in my mind. "They wait for us, Rachel, waiting to take us to a realm beyond pain, beyond suffering." I felt something cold touch my hand. I looked down and saw skeletal fingers intertwined with mine. Horrified, I realized they were my own fingers, my flesh disappearing before my eyes. "Don't fight," Kevin repeated. "Accept their embrace. Become part of something greater." With supreme effort, I managed to break free from the trance. The world came back into focus, the small hospital room reappearing around me. Kevin stood in front of me, his black eyes fixed on me. "You're not ready," he said, disappointment evident in his voice. "But one day, you will understand." Before I could react, Kevin picked up the book from the floor and left the room. I stayed there, trembling, trying to process what had happened. In the days that followed, I tried to alert the hospital administration about Kevin. But who would believe me? How could I explain what I had seen, what I had felt? Kevin continues to work at the hospital. Sometimes, when our paths cross in the corridors, he gives me a knowing look, a small smile on his lips. And I know he's waiting for the moment when I will be ready. Every night, before I sleep, I double-check that all the doors and windows are locked. But deep down, I know that no lock can protect me from what Kevin has awakened, from the creatures that now lurk in the shadows, waiting to take me to the other side. And the worst part? A small part of me, a part that terrifies me, wants to go with them. My first day as a nurse at St. Michael's Hospital was a mix of excitement and nerves. Freshly graduated, I was eager to start my career at the city's renowned hospital. My name is Olivia Carter, and I had no idea that my professional dream would turn into a supernatural nightmare. The hospital was a maze of white corridors and sterile rooms. During the orientation tour, I noticed that the east wing of the 5th floor looked different. The walls had a yellowish tint, as if they had been exposed to smoke for years. The air there was heavier, almost oppressive. "What happened in this corridor?" I asked my supervisor, Nurse Williams. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes nervously scanning the corridor. "There was a fire here a long time ago, but don't worry, everything has been renovated and is perfectly safe." Something in her tone made me doubt her words, but I decided not to press the matter. My first week passed without incident. I was adjusting well to the hospital's routine, learning the protocols, and getting to know my colleagues. It was during the second week that things started to get strange. I was doing my night rounds when I passed through the East Wing corridor. Suddenly, all the lights began flickering frantically. The sound of medical equipment turning on and off echoed down the empty hallway. I ran to check on the patients, but they were all sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the electronic chaos. As I tried to understand what was happening, I heard something that chilled my blood. Whispers, coming from the very walls. They were distorted voices, some pleading for help, others screaming in agony. I ran from there, my heart pounding. When I reached the nurse's station, everything had returned to normal. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But the strange events continued. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut without any wind, and the air in the corridor would suddenly turn cold, even on the hottest days. Other staff members noticed the occurrences too, but no one wanted to talk about it openly. There was a silent fear, an unspoken understanding that something was not right in that corridor. Determined to understand what was happening, I began researching the hospital's history. One afternoon on my day off, I went to the local library and delved into old archives. That was when I discovered the terrible truth. In 1953, a fire devastated the east wing of the 5th floor. 27 people died that night. Patients trapped in their beds, nurses who went back to try to save them, doctors who succumbed to the smoke while evacuating the floor. The fire was contained before it could spread to the rest of the hospital, but the damage was already done. The news reports from the time spoke of screams that echoed through the night, of people seen at the windows. They remained. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the hospital with a new purpose. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I felt I needed to help those lost souls. The next night, I entered the haunted corridor after my shift. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. "I know what happened here," I said to the seemingly empty corridor. "I'm here to help, if you can show me how." For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the lights began flickering again. But this time, instead of chaos, there was a pattern. They flickered in sequence, as if guiding me. I followed the lights to a door at the end of the corridor. It was a small storage room, rarely used. With trembling hands, I turned the knob. The inside of the storage room was covered in dust and cobwebs, but in the center of the room, illuminated by a beam of light that had no apparent source, was an old ledger. I carefully picked up the book. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but still legible. It was the patient and staff register from that fateful night in 1953. As I flipped through the pages, I felt the air around me change. Ethereal forms began to materialize. Men, women, children. Some wore doctors' coats or nurses' uniforms. Others were clearly patients. All looked at me with a mix of hope and sadness. A nurse approached, her translucent form flickering in the dim light. "You found us?" she said, her voice a distant echo. "For so many years, we've tried to get someone's attention. We need our stories to be told, our families to know what really happened." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "How can I help?" The spirit smiled sadly. "The book in your hands contains our stories, our lives, our deaths. Use it to give us a voice, so we can finally rest." In the following days, I dedicated every free moment to transcribing the stories from the book. I researched the names, found living relatives. Some had moved on, others still bore the weight of loss and uncertainty. I started telling the stories, to the families, to the hospital administration, to anyone who would listen. I spoke about the bravery of the nurses who went back into the flames to save patients, about the doctors who sacrificed their lives trying to contain the fire, about the patients who, even in their final moments, helped each other. As the stories were told, I felt a change in the hospital. The air in the corridor became lighter, the strange occurrences decreased. One night I walked into the corridor and saw it filled with spirits, but this time they were smiling. One by one, they began to disappear, finally at peace. The last to leave was the nurse who had spoken to me first. "Thank you," she said, her form already fading. "Take good care of them for us." With those words, she vanished, and the corridor fell silent. The hospital decided to create a memorial for the victims of the fire. A plaque with all the names was placed in the corridor, along with a brief history of what happened that night. Sometimes, when I pass by during my shifts, I feel a slight chill. Not of fear, but of reverence. The corridor is no longer a place of terror, but a reminder of sacrifice and human courage. And if occasionally I hear a whisper or see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I smile and whisper back, "Rest in peace. You are not forgotten." My name is Emily Winters, and I have been working as a nurse at St. Agnes Hospital for 5 years. I never imagined that a simple renovation in the West Wing would reveal such dark secrets. It all began when the administration decided to modernize the old building. During the work, I was assigned to help organize the medical records that would be temporarily relocated. One rainy October afternoon, while stacking dusty boxes, I noticed an irregularity in the wall. One of the wooden panels was loose. Driven by curiosity, I carefully pulled it back. To my surprise, there was a small compartment hidden behind the panel. Inside it, I found a leather-bound diary, yellowed with age. The pages were fragile, the ink faded, but still legible. I opened to the first page and read, "Diary of Dr. Frederick Blackwood, 1,943 to 1,945 inches. The name was unfamiliar to me, but the dates intrigued me. I decided to take the diary home, promising myself to return it the next day. That night, I began to read. The first entries seemed innocent, observations about patients, notes on treatments. But as I continued, the content grew increasingly disturbing. Dr. Blackwood detailed medical experiments conducted on hospital patients, tests with unapproved drugs, experimental surgeries, psychological manipulation, all under the guise of scientific advancement during wartime. The accounts were horrifying. patients subjected to painful procedures without anesthesia, others used as guinea pigs for tests on cold resistance or sleep deprivation. Many did not survive. As I read, I felt the air around me grow colder. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, taking on a life of their own. I heard whispers, so low that I could barely distinguish them. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, affected by the diary's horrifying revelations. I continued reading night after night, unable to stop, even as the strange events intensified. Objects in my apartment began to move on their own. I woke up in the middle of the night with the sensation of being watched. Once I swore I saw a man in a lab coat standing at the foot of my bed, but he disappeared when I blinked. At the hospital, things changed as well. Medical equipment turned on and off by itself. Patients reported visions of strange people in their rooms at night. A fellow nurse swore she saw a woman in an old-fashioned uniform walking down the corridor, only to vanish around the corner. I realized I had awakened something by reading that diary. The spirits of Dr. Blackwood's experiment victims were manifesting, demanding that their stories be heard. Determined to bring them justice, I began to investigate more deeply. I spent hours at the local library researching hospital records from that era. I discovered that many deaths had been covered up, attributed to natural complications or multiple organ failure. One night while researching in the hospital basement, I heard a voice behind me. "You finally found us." I turned and saw a pale woman dressed in an old hospital gown. Her form was translucent, and I could see the shelves through her. Who are you?" I stammered. "My name was Margaret. I was one of Dr. Blackwood's first test subjects," she replied, her voice a distant echo. "There are so many of us trapped here, unable to move on. We need the truth to be revealed." In the days that followed, more spirits manifested. Each one told their horror story, detailing the cruel experiments they endured. I promised them all that I would seek justice. I compiled all the evidence I could find, the diary, hospital records, testimonies from old staff members who were still alive. I presented everything to the hospital's administrative board. At first, they tried to cover it up, but the supernatural phenomena intensified. It was no longer possible to ignore what was happening. Finally, the hospital agreed to conduct a full investigation. Historians and researchers were called in. The story of the illegal experiments came to light, shocking the medical community and the general public. A memorial was erected on the hospital grounds, honoring the victims of the experiments. Their stories were told, their names remembered. The hospital established an ethical medical research fund, ensuring that such atrocities would never happen again. As the truth was revealed and justice served, the supernatural phenomena diminished. The spirits, finally at peace, began to move on. On the night the memorial was inaugurated, I saw Margaret one last time. She smiled, her body already dissipating into the air. "Thank you," she whispered, before disappearing completely. St. Agnes Hospital was never the same. The shadows of its dark past were exposed to the light, bringing with them the chance for healing and redemption. Dr. Blackwood's diary is now on display at the memorial, a grim reminder of the horrors that can occur when medical ethics are abandoned in the name of progress. And I, Emily Winters, continue my work as a nurse, more aware than ever of the sacred responsibility we have to our patients. The night shift at Mercy Hospital had always been quiet, but that Friday, everything changed. My name is Sarah Collins, head nurse in the ICU, and I will never forget the moment when the emergency doors burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney. In the center, a motionless figure lay covered by a white sheet. Male, approximately 30 years old, found unconscious in the forest. One of them reported quickly. When we removed the sheet, I froze. The patient's face. There was no face. Where there should have been features, there was only a shapeless mass of flesh and scars. "My God," I whispered. "What happened to him?" No one had answers. There were no documents, no identification. It was as if this man had come from nowhere. In the following hours, we worked frantically to stabilize him. His vital signs were erratic, his blood different. Under the microscope, the cells moved in ways I had never seen before. As the night wore on, I noticed strange movements in the corridor. Shadowy figures dressed in black peered through the ICU window. When I approached, they vanished like smoke. On the third night, something even more disturbing happened. I entered the room to check the patient's vital signs and found a tall man in a black suit standing beside the bed. "Who are you?" I asked, my heart racing. "Visitors are not allowed at this hour." The man turned slowly. His face was obscured by impossible shadows. "He should not be here." His voice was a chilling whisper. "He belongs to us." Before I could react, the man vanished, literally disappeared into thin air. Trembling, I approached the patient. For a moment, I thought I saw his fingers move, forming a strange pattern. In the following days, I plunged into a frantic investigation. I scoured missing persons records, consulted burn specialists, even contacted a friend who worked for the government. The answers I found were more terrifying than the questions. Rumors of secret experiments in a hidden facility in the forest, reports of strange lights in the night sky, and always mentions of men in black appearing when someone asked too many questions. A week after the patient's arrival, I received an anonymous package. Inside, there was a flash drive and a note. "The truth is here. Be careful." The files on the flash drive were shocking. Videos of experiments on humans trying to create something. Hybrids, super soldiers. The images were confusing, distorted, but the horror was clear. I recognized our patient in one of the videos. His face was still intact, his eyes filled with terror as he underwent procedures that defied comprehension. That night, I entered the patient's room determined to find answers. To my surprise, he was awake, sitting on the bed. "You saw," he said. His voice was rough, distorted by the lack of lips. "You know." "Who did this to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Not who. What?" He moved, and for a moment I saw something impossible, his skin rippling as if something moved beneath it. They opened doors that should remain closed, brought things from this world and others. A noise in the corridor made me turn. When I looked back, the patient had disappeared. The bed was empty, the sheets perfectly arranged. I ran to the corridor, but it was deserted. The security cameras later showed only static during those minutes. In the days that followed, I tried to tell my story. To the hospital administration, to the police, to anyone who would listen. But no one believed me. The patient's records mysteriously disappeared. Colleagues who were on duty that night swore they remembered nothing unusual. I began to notice that I was being followed. Dark cars parked in front of my house, figures in the shadows watching me. One night coming home, I found my apartment ransacked. On the bathroom mirror, a message written in something that looked like blood. "Forget everything or be next." But I couldn't forget. I couldn't ignore what I had seen, what I knew. Somewhere out there, terrible experiments continued, and I was the only one who could expose the truth. I packed some clothes, took all the money I had, and disappeared into the night. As I drive to an unknown destination, I know I'm being hunted by men and by things that are not entirely human. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I can't stop. The truth must be revealed, no matter the cost. And maybe, just maybe, I can prevent more innocents from suffering the faceless man's fate. The car creaks on the dark road, and in the rearview mirror, I see strange lights in the sky. My journey is just beginning, and I feel that the horrors I've faced so far are just the tip of the iceberg. My name is Rachel Morgan, and 6 months ago, I started working the midnight shift at Blackwood Memorial Hospital. At first, I was excited about the opportunity. The pay was good, and the hospital had an excellent reputation. But now I would give anything to go back. It all began on a seemingly ordinary night. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on patients and updating charts. The silence of the hospital at night always impressed me. The contrast with the daytime chaos was almost palpable. It was when I passed the nurses' station that I noticed something strange. The large wall clock had stopped. The hands were frozen at 3 o'clock. I frowned, thinking the battery must have died. I made a mental note to inform maintenance in the morning. I continued my rounds, but something was bothering me, a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. It was when I entered room 237 that I realized what it was. The digital clock beside the patient's bed also read 3 o'clock. My heart raced. 2 clocks stopping at the same time? What a strange coincidence. I pulled out my phone to check the real time, but the screen was black. No matter what I did, it wouldn't turn on. A piercing scream cut through the silence, making my blood run cold. I ran into the corridor, my heart pounding. The scream came from room 242. When I opened the door, the scene before me left me paralyzed with horror. The patient, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, was having a violent seizure. Her eyes were rolled back, and a dark foam was oozing from her mouth. I rushed to help her, shouting for assistance. But as I reached the bed, something even more disturbing happened. The shadows in the room began to move, not subtly but like living creatures, slithering along the walls and ceiling. For a moment I swore I saw faces forming in the shadows, mouths open in silent screams. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating. When I opened my eyes, the shadows had returned to normal, but the patient was still seizing. In the following minutes, chaos erupted. Alarms blared throughout the floor as patient after patient went into convulsions. The staff ran from room to room, desperately trying to stabilize the situation. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The patients calmed down. The monitors returned to normal. I looked at the clock, 3:01. In the days that followed, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Electrical failures, contamination in some medication, even mass hysteria were suggested as explanations. But I knew there was something more, something that no one wanted to admit. I began to research. I spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers and historical records. That's when I found something disturbing. The land on which the hospital was built had a dark history. In the 18th century, it was the meeting place of an obscure cult. They practiced ancient rituals, seeking power and immortality. And the central point of their rituals? Always at 3 a.m. The more I read, the more horrified I became. Reports of human sacrifices, invocations of entities beyond human comprehension. And always, the hour of 3 a.m. was mentioned as the veil hour, when the barrier between our world and something else was thinnest. I decided to share my findings with my supervisor, Nurse Karen. She listened patiently, but I saw the disbelief in her eyes. "Rachel," she said gently, "you've been working too much. Maybe it's time to take a few days off." But I knew I couldn't stop. Something was happening in that hospital, something beyond normal comprehension. And I was determined to find out what it was. In the nights that followed, I stayed more alert. I watched closely as 3 o'clock approached, and then it happened again. Exactly at 3 o'clock, all the clocks stopped. The air became heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw hooded figures in the window reflections. I ran through the corridors, checking on the patients. Many were agitated, murmuring in languages I didn't recognize. Others were completely still, their eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. Then I saw something that made me question my sanity. At the end of the corridor, a door I had never noticed before. It was old, made of dark wood and covered in strange symbols. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. When I touched the doorknob, I felt an intense cold coursing through my body. The door creaked open. Beyond it, there was no room but a vast empty space. A black sky, devoid of stars, stretched infinitely. And floating in that void were impossible forms, writhing and moving, creatures that defied logic and sanity. A voice echoed in my mind. "You have seen beyond the veil, nurse. Now you are part of it." I screamed and slammed the door shut. When I turned around, the corridor was normal again. The clocks read 3:01, and the patients were calm in their beds. In the days that followed, I questioned my own sanity. Had I imagined it all? But the occurrences continued night after night. Always at 3 o'clock, always with events that defied explanation. I decided I needed help. Through my research, I found a local history professor, Dr. Alan Blackwood. When I mentioned the hospital's name, I saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. Blackwood Memorial Hospital, he said slowly. Do you know why it has that name? I shook my head, feeling a chill down my spine. My great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Blackwood, was the leader of the cult that practiced rituals on that land, he explained. The family donated the land for the hospital as a form of redemption, I suppose. Dr. Blackwood told me stories that made me question everything I believed. Ezekiel's cult had opened doors to dimensions beyond our comprehension, and those doors, once opened, never fully closed. The hospital, he said, was built as a form of containment. The walls are not just brick and mortar, but symbols and ancient spells designed to keep the forces from the other side at bay. But something had changed. The balance was breaking, and I, somehow, had become a central piece in this cosmic game. With Dr. Blackwood's help, I began to learn about the ancient rituals, not to practice them, but to understand them, to find a way to strengthen the weakening barriers. Each night at the hospital became a battle. At 3 o'clock, I no longer fled from the strange events. I faced them. I used the knowledge Dr. Blackwood had passed on to calm the patients, to push back the shadows that came to life. But I knew it was a losing fight. Each night, the manifestations grew stronger. The creatures from the other side were getting closer to fully crossing over. It was on a particularly chaotic night that I made a drastic decision. At 2:59, I entered the hospital's old chapel, carrying the ancient grimoires Dr. Blackwood had lent me. When the clock struck 3 o'clock and the chaos began, I initiated the ritual. Not to invoke or banish, but to seal, to reinforce the barriers our ancestors had created. The words left my mouth in a language I didn't know, but that my heart and soul understood. The air around me filled with energy, sparks of light dancing in the air. I felt as if every cell in my body was being torn apart and remade. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't stop. The future of the hospital, the city, perhaps the world depended on it. When the clock struck 3:01, everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted but victorious. In the days that followed, the hospital returned to normal. No more strange events at 3 o'clock, no more moving shadows or inexplicable seizures. But I knew it was only a temporary truce. The forces from the other side were still there, waiting, looking for a breach. Now, every night at 2:59, I go to the chapel. I repeat the ritual, reinforcing the barriers. It is my burden, my responsibility. I am Rachel Morgan, the midnight shift nurse, and every night I fight a battle that no one else can see, against forces that no one else understands. Sometimes, in the darkest moments of the night, I wonder how long I can keep going, how long until the forces from the other side find a way through. But then I remember the patients, the innocent lives that depend on me, and I find the strength to continue. Because at Blackwood Memorial Hospital, the midnight shift never truly ends. And I am the last line of defense against the chaos lurking beyond the veil. Little Jamie arrived at St. Mary's Hospital on a rainy October night. Found wandering the streets alone, without identification or family, he was brought in by social services. My name is Elaine Foster, and as the head nurse of the pediatric ward, I was assigned to care for him. From the beginning, Jamie was different. His deep blue eyes seemed to hold a wisdom beyond his apparent 8 years. He wouldn't speak, no matter how hard we tried. The doctors couldn't explain his condition. Physically, he seemed healthy, but he remained in impenetrable silence. On the 3rd day of his hospitalization, I noticed something curious. Jamie was always drawing. His drawings, made with crayons on white sheets, were disturbing. Scenes of accidents, people crying, shadowy figures lurking in the corners. I tried not to give them much importance, attributing the macabre images to possible traumas he might have suffered. It was the next morning that everything changed. I passed by Jamie's room for his morning checkup and found him sitting on the bed, staring intently at his latest drawing. It was the image of a man lying on the ground, a red pool around him. In the corner of the paper, a carefully drawn clock read 10:30. I swallowed hard, a shiver running down my spine. "Jamie, dear, what is this?" I asked softly. He just looked at me with those deep eyes without saying a word. At 10:28 that morning, I heard screams coming from the corridor. I ran out and saw a scene that froze my blood. Dr. Thompson, our chief surgeon, was lying on the floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. He had suffered a sudden brain aneurysm. I looked at the clock on the wall, 10:30. In the following days, I couldn't get Jamie's drawing out of my head. Could it be possible that... No, it was madness. Coincidences happen, I told myself. But then came the second drawing, an overturned ambulance, again with a precise time. And exactly at that time, we received the news that one of our ambulances had been in an accident. I could no longer deny it. Somehow, Jamie was predicting these events. But how? And more importantly, why? I began spending more time with him, studying each new drawing with a mix of fascination and terror. I realized that not all the drawings came true. Some seemed to be just nightmares from a troubled mind, but those marked with a specific time, they always happened. I tried to warn my colleagues, but who would believe me? A child predicting the future through drawings. I would be sent for a psychiatric evaluation before they could take my words seriously. One night, while making my rounds, I found Jamie sitting on his bed trembling. Silent tears ran down his face as he handed me his latest drawing. My heart nearly stopped. It was an image of the hospital on fire, people running, screaming. And in the center of the image, a shadowy figure with red eyes. The clock in the drawing read 3 a.m. "Jamie," I whispered, my voice trembling, "is this going to happen today?" For the first time since he arrived, Jamie spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in years. "He's coming," he said. The man of shadows. In the following days, I did everything to prepare. I checked every fire extinguisher, every emergency exit. I alerted security, inventing a bomb threat to increase vigilance. But how to explain that the real threat was something I barely understood? On the fateful night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed on duty, patrolling the corridors, my eyes constantly checking the clock. 2:55 a.m. Nothing out of the ordinary. 2:58 a.m. A cold wind blew through the corridor despite the closed windows. 2:59 a.m. The lights flickered. 3 a.m. The world seemed to stop for a moment, and then chaos ensued. Fire alarms blared throughout the hospital. Smoke began to spread rapidly, coming from various points. How was it possible that so many fires started simultaneously? I ran from room to room, helping to evacuate patients. The panic was palpable, screams echoing through the corridors. But amid the chaos, one figure stood out. At the end of the corridor, I saw a man, tall, dressed entirely in black, his face obscured by impossible shadows. When he turned to me, I saw two bright red points where his eyes should be. "The man of shadows," I whispered, remembering Jamie's words. The figure smiled, a smile that promised pain and suffering, and then he vanished into the smoke. The following hours were a blur of sirens, screams, and intense heat from the flames. Miraculously, we managed to evacuate all the patients. The fire was controlled, but the hospital was severely damaged. When the dust settled and investigations began, no one could explain the origin of the fires. Electrical failure in multiple points? Sabotage? There were many theories, but none seemed satisfactory. Jamie disappeared that night. Amid the chaos of the evacuation, he simply vanished. The searches found no trace of him. Weeks passed. The hospital was rebuilt. The routine returned to normal. But I never forgot Jamie or the man of shadows. Sometimes, when I do my night rounds, I feel a shiver, as if I'm being watched. And occasionally I find drawings, scenes of accidents, tragedies, left in empty rooms or deserted corridors. I know Jamie is still out there, somewhere, drawing, predicting, trying to warn us, and I know the man of shadows is also lurking, waiting for his next opportunity. I continue my work as a nurse, caring for the patients, but now I'm always on alert, because I learned the hard way that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. And sometimes, the most important warnings come from the most unlikely sources, like the silent drawings of a lost child.